Okay, so we got our scene. I got a bunch of stuff scattered around. I'm playing around with these geometry nodes. They're pretty cool. Like I said, there's a lot I can do with it, but I can go ahead and close this now because I like where this is at. I'm going to turn this back to the timeline editor so it's out of my way, and always good time to throw a save at my computer. Let's start thinking about what we need to do to get this to be a final scene. If I turn on light, this lighting mode, there's nothing on render because I need a light. But if I add a light, say in this case I'm outside, so it probably should be a sunlight. And let's rotate it and move it a little bit and add lighting mode. It's lighting, but the background is still dark. Even if I really crank this up to something really obnoxiously high, I still don't have a good background here. So what I need to do is add a sky by adding a background. Up here by default is our little settings for the world. See, it looks like a little globe. And right now there's nothing in this. There's nothing in our scene. There's nothing in our background. We need to add a shader for our world, just like we'd add a shader to an object. So let's go to the shading tab. And instead of the object level, which is, see, it's like that, I'm going to switch it to world. And let's hit home to zoom in on the basis of what's here, but there's nothing here. So I'm going to name this world sky matte. And we can see world sky matte has nothing. It just has a color. And let's set this here. I can set this color to whatever I want, and whatever I set the color to, it's going to affect this environment. And if I set the strength up higher, you can see it starts to light that environment. This isn't bad, but it's really flat and it's pretty boring. So what I want to do is add a gradient to it. We're going to add a new texture, and it's called a gradient texture. If I look at the gradient texture by itself, it's just a black and white object in its own scene. And I can hit Control T to add a mapping node to it so that I can take my linear and rotate it 90 degrees on the y-axis, and you can see it goes dark here and lighter up there, which is exactly what I want. So with this plugged in to this viewport, I'm going to run it into color, into the background, into surface, set the strength back to 1, so I'm not trying to obliterate everything. Now I can start to choose the colors now that I have the black and white colors. So let's go under search and let's add a ramp, so a color ramp. And then I'm going to add a mix node, mix RGB, and that's going to go into the factor, and it's going to go into color. So now I can choose a couple colors, so like a dark, maybe this is like a light blue, which is going to be like my horizon, and this is going to be a deeper, darker kind of blue. So let's make this one really pale. The biggest mistake you can make here is going too strong in color value, because the skies can actually be pretty subtle. So let's go like this. We can see in my environment now, I can use these sliders to determine where that apex of this little light comes in. Let's see. Pretty high up, I can adjust my Z location. Just kind of scrolling it to see if I can find it. Try this. Just really tighten them up. No, see them. How far back do you think I have to get before I'm gonna see? Oh, there it is. The zenith is just like really high up. So I think, oh, you know what? That's why it wasn't kind of moving, because I rotated it. So I need to actually move it along the x-axis. Perfect. So yeah, the x-axis here is what determines like its kind of height, because I rotated it using the y-axis. So now I can decide where my deeper and darker blue is. So I got like a nice sky blue, and you can see the strength actually affects our whole scene. Make sure we go over to our Eevee tab, and we're going to turn on things like ambient occlusion, turn on bloom, screen space reflections, motion blur maybe does or doesn't have to be on, but it's going to help us fill out our scene, because now, like I said before, we've got some actual lighting, which is pretty cool, which means it's time to really think about this sun and what it's doing for us. So I'm going to give the sun a little bit of strength, let it cast some shadows, and right now it's not doing a whole lot for us shadow-wise because it's pretty soft, and its location maybe isn't great. So I'm going to take my rotation tool, and just as we play around, what we're doing with the direction light is looking for a direction for it to be in. to give us some interesting shadows. So something a little lower, something that's gonna like paint a little light across my environment. So, you know, we're seeing some like nice, distinct, sharp little shadows here. Something like that. And the higher my strength is, it's gonna brighten things, but it's also gonna make our shadows more intense. In my light, I also wanna turn on contact shadows, which is gonna, it's a little hard to see here, but this actually changes a couple of the shadows that like are objects running into each other. So you can see here, this object colliding on the surface, you can see like it adds some extra shadows in here that are like points contacting on each other. So that's going pretty well. We're already creating something pretty neat. I got one more thing I want to show you how to do here to make our environments really work, and that's to add some clouds. Okay, so now what I want to do is I'm going to create some clouds using volumetrics. Volumetrics work a little bit better in something rendered like Cycles than in something real-time like Eevee, but we can still use them here. Let's add a new cube, and I'm just going to stick it up in the sky for now. And let's give them some size. Let's scale them up, but I'm not going to apply the scale. I'm just going to scale up the overall size of what I'm looking at here. And now what I want to do is change up this from world, go back to object, and I'm going to create a new material. Clouds. Demo time. So this little object, you can see I have a shader in here, just like we've usually used to, this principled shader, and it's plugged into surface. But you might have noticed there's also something called volume. Now, volume takes input in and it turns it into sort of a smoky cloud-like thing called a volume. There's a couple things I have to do to get this volume working. For one, this shader ain't gonna work. So let's delete it, Shift A, and look at shader. And under shader, there's something called a principled volume. So I'm gonna plug in my principled volume to volume and not surface. This now is giving me, you can see it's already starting to form this weird, smoky, hazy, cloudy thing. We wanna make sure under Eevee that our volumetrics have some of the settings on them. For instance, if you're clipping, I think by default on volumetrics is only set to 100. You wouldn't be able to see it from back here. So I set that up higher to something like 10,000. And our tile size should be in here. I also want lighting and shading both turned on because it's going to mean it's going to get light and it's going to get shadows. So similar to how I was able to create in this cube, you can see it's sort of filling with an invisible smoke, and that's the volume. So similar to how I did the background where I used a gradient, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to add a gradient texture and plug it instead of into color, I'm plugging it into density because this controls the thickness of this. I'm going to set the color to white because that's what I want it to be at. It's a volume and it's a cloud, so it should be white in its factor here. And just like I did before, I need to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. Now, instead of plugging this into generated, I want it to be by the actual object itself. So we rotate around, you can see it's got the linear gradient. It's moving to the side. But if I change this from linear to spherical, it's going to create a sphere at the center of this. And this sphere is something that we can use some of the scale and size, rotation, and position of our mapping to actually change its shape to make it look a little bit more like a cloud. Right after this cloud, I'm going to add a ramp, a color ramp node, because just like anything else, it's just black and white information, so the density, so I can clip it to sort of tighten up and make the cloud feel larger, smaller, or more dense. Because it's just playing a value of 0 to 1. But the density can be higher than 1, so if I actually click on this color, I could set the highest value of density higher than 1 to something like 2. And now I'm going from a density of 0 to a density of 2, because again, it's just information being passed through. This is nice, but it's a little boring. Let's break up the shape a little bit. So what I want to do is add a Voronoi texture, just kind of like I did when we were doing textures for the buildings the other week. And I want to take this Voronoi texture and use its distance information to change the shape that's going to this gradient, which means I got to combine it into this. The way I'm going to do that is actually before I do that, I'm going to change this overall dome shape. And I'm going to show you how we do this. So with the curves, vector curves, we can connect that into here, and it's going to readjust how this shape is done. And what's cool is if you come into Z, we can actually start to alter and dome out the shape. It's a little hard to explain. It's a lot of vector math, but what I'm basically doing is altering how the program is calculating the vectors and the UVs. So I'm going to kind of clamp it down to different sides to give it like a tower look, or for it to go lower into its scene. So instead, I'm going to clamp it to, right about here, give it an interesting kind of dome half shape, and I can move it up and down in its own little space relative to its position here. But otherwise, it seems it's going pretty well. And now I want to combine that with this Voronoi. So let's add another mix RGB, because even though these are purple, meaning they're vector XYZ, XYZ and RGB are actually interchangeable in the shader editor. Most other programs, you have to like do a converter. They don't care here. I love that. And we're going to go from Voronoi distance into this mix. And let's set the scale to something small, like 2. So we see it's starting to fill up with clouds in here, and it's applying my Voronoi and it's bubbling things up. But I want to control that. And how do I control any two-dimensional information? With a color ramp, of course. So as soon as I stick the color ramp in, you can start to see it starting to turn into like these individual bubbles, these individual spheres. So this is going pretty well for it, and I can choose how strong this effect is. So like max Voronoi to just a little bit. So however strong I want that to be. But I don't want to mix it. I actually want to do an overlay. It's sort of like layering one on top of the other. And this works a little bit better for this and helps it filter out. So I'm generating my cloud, and it's going pretty well, but I need a little bit more sort of puffiness to what I'm doing here. So let's add some more volume. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to create another texture that I like to use for noise called noise texture. Now this Voronoi also needs the same object information coming in to work properly. So let's click this into that, and there, that's a lot better. It's giving me my cloud distribution. Of course, I can, change up its scale, how large or small it is on this plane, making adjustments to it. But I want these individual clouds to be a lot rougher. So I'm going to do the same thing I did here with this overlay color ramp. Just Shift D. And I'm going to go noise and plug this noise into my color ramp to let me control this. So I have a little slider for this. And this overlay is going to go from object into this color, into this vector, and then this gets plugged into its own vector. And I'm just adding a lot more noise to it. You can see, would you look at that? I'm getting some clouds. I can use this to clamp my effect, and I can set my detail a lot higher to make it noisier, and I can change up the scale to decide how broken up this is. So a smaller scale gives me kind of like puffier, softer clouds. A smaller scale gives me more of that noise. Do the same thing too with this factors, decide how strong or weak that factor is. And so now in this shape, I can play with like my y-axis and like push them away from each other a little bit. Let's scale up this whole scene. And now I have a cloud field, scale it in Z, that's going to fill this overall volume. And the bigger I make it, the more cloud cover I have in my scene. So thinking about where my camera is, I want it to be sort of back here and pretty big. And then I get to decide with my clouds, using some of these sliders, how dense and how clamped things are. So if I want these clouds to be a lot tighter or smaller, I can pull them out here. And I can do the same thing, clamping them down to themselves to decide how strong or weak they should be. There's, of course, lots of ways of doing clouds, and you can keep adding more nodes and more noise and more Voronoi and more adding and more. But I wanted to show you how to set this up by itself. Let me set my sun down just a little bit. I feel like it's a little strong. And when you're all set and you feel like you got something you like, time to give it some render and put it together. There you have it. If we want to change up and make these clouds look a little stronger, we can go back to volumetrics and change my samples to something a little higher, like 128. You know, I can play with how strong these shadows are or how even the distribution is, like up it to something like 64. Of course, as you do this, it just makes it more intensive on the computer, so be careful. The higher this number goes, the actual lower resolution is. So if you want to really fine, you can go down to 2 pixels and get really, really fine resolution. But these clouds are going to be mostly affected by the angle of our sunlight. So wherever our sun is going to be how our clouds are looking. So there you go. We got a skylight and we got some clouds. Yeah, it's fun. There's a lot of stuff you can do with it. Play with some of these settings. The curve editor too, to me, is like where you really get to change the shape of these things and really affect how they look. But it's a cool way to make a whole field of clouds instead of just making 1 or 2 clouds in a system. And so just look at the sky a little bit and change some of these curves, and you can see there's a lot of variations we can get on top of that. All right, that's it. That's the wrap up for it. Thanks everybody. We just render it and light it like we do anything else. Looking forward to seeing what everyone comes up with. Bye.